There has been some consternation in recent weeks over reports that the sales data for Switch 2 might have been low over November. For those who missed the news, Tech Radar gives the bullet points as follows. Hardware and physical software unit sales in November 2025 were the worst they've been in the US since 1995. Circana reports that 1.6 million units of video game hardware were sold in the US last month, which was the lowest since the 1.4 million units that were sold in the US in 1995. The PlayStation 5 was November's best-selling console in both units and dollars, and Black Ops 7 was the best-selling game of the month. It also suggests that Switch and Switch 2 sales in November may be down from the Switch sales in 2024, despite 2024 being the very end of that console's life. I would also recommend Kit and Krista's recent deep dive on this, in which they note the unusual example of Nintendo of America highlighting price discounts, something they've historically been very loath to do, and the suggestion that Nintendo of America may be concerned about not meeting what will be framed as their commitment to Japan in terms of delivering sales. We should also give a broad caveat that this is only one of many global markets, albeit a hugely significant market, and only 1 month. A month, it must be said, which has unusual characteristics because of the warping effect of Black Friday, which focuses on deals, but which is nonetheless very significant for driving total number of sales across the year. This is certainly an interesting indication of where we may be. So let's wind back and unpick all this a little bit. For broad context, before launch, Nintendo were projecting 15 million Switch 2 sold during this financial year ending March 2026. I think I'm on record in saying something in the 16 to 90 million range, which is now more conservative than Nintendo's new 19 million projection as of November's 2025 financial report. I know many people were expecting a flat-out 20 million on year one, long before the console launched, but those kinds of figures were always likely to be a stretch. Simply put, the first year or two of a console's life is usually hard going, and I refer to the chart on screen for evidence of this. The chart shows the sales by financial year for the Nintendo consoles released during this century. This does create a slightly distortive effect because many of these consoles were released in November or even right at the end of the financial year in February or March. The Switch 2 is the earliest in a financial year that a console has released since the Nintendo 64, 3 decades prior, and so it will have a very strong year one, come what may, compared to its predecessors. But what is evident is that the most successful consoles, DS in green, Switch in navy blue, even the Wii in purple, peak far later, usually around years 3, 4, or 5. Why is this? Well, for one thing, supply issues are usually resolved, and this was certainly a constraint on the early Wii and Switch performances. Switch 2 has broadly avoided stock issues, which is good. Moreover, the huge hype leading out from the Switch has given them a huge start. However, there's also the high price to consider. Now, long-time viewers of this channel may remember this chart from my 2024 videos highlighting that Nintendo's consoles in blue had historically tracked what in 2024 prices were around $400, while their handhelds had progressively been rising in price. People will have perspectives on the economic context of these releases, but my point then as now is that Nintendo have a real terms price point that they like for their main consoles, and they're hardly much above it with Switch 2. Indeed, there's a possibility that this headroom was added in as a contingency, which may be why they didn't respond to tariff costs and perhaps even why they may resist slightly longer than we expect, increasing their console price in the face of escalating RAM prices, though if the current pace continues, that price increase would become far more likely. A console on launch day, in theory, therefore, should be the most expensive it will ever be, and although in current times price increases can no longer be so confidently ruled out, Nintendo will nevertheless aspire to have the console become more accessible to consumers, not less, over time. The thing is that while they want to sell a lot of consoles, there is also an art to how to do this. Simply dropping the price or having massive gains drop intensively would bolster sales now. But sales at lower prices mean they lose income from those sales, and they might dent their future release plans by storing up problems for the future if they release too many games too soon. What they want to do is to sustain the console at a price which people will stretch to, relative to the competition, and only at their own pace, add in sweeteners. Now, so far, they've been selling mainly to die-hard fans, but that was always going to be a well that was going to run dry, and it seems to me that 10 to 15 million might well be that number. About the same, in fact, as the Wii U install base. And this is against the context of consoles being down across the board, after all. So far, they have actually done remarkably little to incentivize broader purchases. Now, personally, I love Donkey Kong Bonanza, Kirby Air Riders, and Metroid Prime 4, but it's fair to say that for most people, Mario Kart World is the only true AAA, and even that feels undercooked compared to what we might expect in its final form if we remember how Mario Kart 8 evolved from 2014 to its last major update in 2023. I really like Mario Kart World, but I don't for a second think that they're done developing it. They haven't even released or even announced, heck, they haven't even teased major Mario, Zelda, Switch Sports, Ring Fit, or Animal Crossing content. In fact, the games ahead are hardly likely to inspire mass console adoption. Love Fire Emblem though I do, it remains a relatively niche series, and Yoshi and Mario Tennis Fever aren't the kind of thing that drive hundreds of dollars in purchases for most people either. Add to this, Nintendo haven't centrally loosened prices, although some retailers have shown a bit of leeway. What we do know is that they have a consistent film slate, and if 2023 showed anything, it's that films drive sales in a big way. I think they can expect elevated sales throughout the April to June quarter next year, in addition to strong sales in the holiday window through the inevitable big new AAA title, in addition to generational Pokemon. In other words, they have a huge amount of options in reserve to use. Why not use them now then? Well, for one thing, they don't have to. The art of selling a system like this, which potentially has an 8, 9, 10, 11-year lifespan, is to look to get the maximum juice with the minimum squeeze at each point. If you look at the Wii, you can see the risk of getting huge sales early on if the demand then fizzles out and then things fall off a cliff because there's not the game pipeline in place to support it. Nintendo needs to sell well now, sure, but they also want this thing to continue to sell and potentially to continue to grow its sales velocity in 2 years 4 and 5. Selling a consistent number at aggressive margins and with fixed costs would be preferable to them than a feast then famine situation. Now that'll be tough in certain respects because Switch 2 sold incredibly well out of the gate, but if it finds resistance during November, that may actually be a positive sign overall that they're on target to maximize their revenue opportunities. It does suggest that some kind of adjustment will be necessary to their strategy, but I'd venture to suggest that this would be a subtle one and possibly even one they are already announcing, such as more promotion around the movie. They have the opportunity in February to decide how much they want to reveal about the time ahead, and in this case, they may decide to be a little more forthcoming, although I think they will remain broadly cautious. I think they have a major Mario title for this October, but I also think they'll want to clean up from sales of past Mario content around this time of the movie. Showing a big new Mario game may help shift consoles, but it could also discourage people from buying Galaxy 1 plus 2 plus a whole host of previously released games which will have huge margins and are proven hits. They can then get extra sales in the holiday season from announcing a new game and build on the momentum. So if Switch 2 sales for the holiday quarter come in somewhat below their ambitious targets, that suggests to me that their targets were ambitious enough, perhaps a little bit too ambitious, and they still will doubtless have a very strong first year without having wasted any ammo for years ahead. Competition with PlayStation 5 hardly matters to them at this phase of the console cycle. With PlayStation 5 in its sixth holiday and Switch 2 in its first, PlayStation 5 is obviously going to be more affordable than the top Sony hardware in most years to come in Switch 2's lifespan, while Switch 2 will naturally be the most expensive it is likely to be, barring of course necessary price increases due to manufacturing costs. Now, obviously, there's a balance to be struck here. If Switch 2 sales go off a cliff, it's not just negative headlines that Nintendo will need to weather. They also will end up with gluts of supply, and since their business model seems to assume economies of scale from large production outputs, that could actually raise their costs and cut into their margins. Therefore, some tactical price offers might be preferable to simply having this glut of supply. I doubt they'll change the base price of the system, but for example, adding a year's Nintendo Switch Online or Super Mario Wonder's Nintendo Switch 2 edition would be a good opportunity to attract people who are interested in the films, but at a probably relatively low cost, even compared to the Mario Kart World bundle. I also think they have a lot of options on the table with the Nintendo Switch 2 editions generally. At some point soon, they are going to face the problem that a massive chunk of their Nintendo Switch Online install base is either going to transition to Switch 2 or simply leave the service. Offering a greater range of Nintendo Switch 2 edition upgrades free on Nintendo Switch Online, or even just on the expansion pack, could be a very effective inducement. After all, the nature of the games that they've focused on upgrading is that most of them have large install bases on the original Switch already. Again, they won't want to move on this too quickly. They'll want the initial DLC sales, and once you start to suggest that this kind of content could become available as a pack-in on Nintendo Switch Online as a default, you start incentivizing people just to wait it out, which would undercut their ambitions for subsequent Nintendo Switch 2 editions in the future. Still, following in the footsteps of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom is the kind of way that they could show their response to this, picking away at potential new customer bases with a chisel rather than a sledgehammer at this point. There's a further consideration. Nintendo has made the decision to make a decisive break from Switch 1 game production, but they're still sitting on a large amount of Switch consoles. Keeping Switch afloat was vital until they had a decent install base, but by March, they should have conservatively 15 million, if not more, Switch 2s sold, so they don't need to keep pushing the original machine in order to shore up their user bases. If they're going to offer discounts, doing so on the higher margin, older products, where they may want to clear stock, might be a more expedient solution than doing so on their newer system that they want to nurture to decade-long success. So, in early 2026, there'll be plenty of internal pressure to drive sales and plenty of criticism from outside that Nintendo of Japan aren't doing much to drive sales, especially in the West. But I think they will probably hold their nerve for a while longer. They have a lot of shots in the locker, and while Switch 2 is expensive relative to the competition at present, Switch Lite remains barely more than half the price, and with a vast number of games, and Nintendo will want to push that as well. They still have a budget offer, and while new development has been discontinued, they're still supporting the Switch with games including major titles like Super Mario Galaxy 1+2, Metroid Prime 4, and Tomodachi Life. That is where I think the discount option will remain for the year ahead. That's it for this video, but do check out the others on screen, see the Patreon for early ad-free and exclusive content, and do come back next time for another Nintendo Forecast.